This video is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for supporting the show. And please keep in mind that this video deals with a few different sensitive subjects. In early 1995, Rivers Cuomo felt depressed. After extensive touring and his first taste of fame, the Weezer frontman felt isolated and alone. Before, he would write songs to process his feelings, but now he felt like he had no personal life and nothing to write about. But this feeling of being stuck would become a song. The song's called Walt Disney, and it's referencing a conspiracy theory that Walt was cryogenically frozen, and in some stories, stored underneath Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland. Walt was frozen, and Rivers Cuomo felt frozen. But that's just a conspiracy theory. Walt was actually cremated. Still though, there are so many conspiracy theories about Walt Disney. When discussing the man, it's hard not to get caught up in myth. He was a complicated person. For some, he was a genius, while others thought he was a tyrant. He created so much incredible media that promotes love and understanding, but he also did some heinous things. It seems like everyone has an opinion on Walt, but sometimes it's hard to separate fact from fiction, and often the truth is mixed up with rumors. So let's talk about the real Walt Disney.
Women in the animation
Within
department.
the studio group, if we do something that isn't right, members of the staff, it just isn't right. You can't do that.
Walt Disney is still here. Though he died in 1966, he's lived on through his art. The movies he made are still being shown to kids growing up today, and even though Disneyland was the only theme park he himself opened in his lifetime, his influence is spread out to multiple resorts and parks around the world. And Walt still has a place in culture. Quotes of his are incredibly common in classrooms, on t-shirts, and on mugs. There are even things he didn't coin that are still credited to him, simply because they sound like something he might have said. And that's because when most people think of Walt Disney, they think of inspiration. They think of a kind man who created movies about being a good person. A man who was hardworking, but ultimately created a work environment where he was so friendly with his employees, and some people even affectionately called him Uncle Walt. But then there's the other side of Disney. Many people don't have positive things to say about Walt. While some see him as a strong leader, others see a ruthless tyrant who represented some of the worst things about US American society. And because of Disney's very family-friendly image, this take on Walt has become a hot topic. It's been a running joke for a long time in mainstream culture to show the quote-unquote real Walt Disney, which is often seen as an evil counterpart to his loving public persona.
Welcome back, Mr. Disney.
Are the Jews gone yet?
No.
Put me back in.
And on the internet, people have made entire careers just talking about the dark side of Disney. Any eerie situation, Disneyland death, or secret about the company is fair game. And since Disney as a company often doesn't want to be open about these things, it gets weirder. I get the appeal. People want to see the other side of Disney and the things the company won't tell you about. But something I've also noticed throughout my many years in the Disney fandom is that it's incredibly difficult to separate fact from fiction. There are so many conspiracy theories about Disney that are easy to debunk, like the cryogenic freezing, but then there are things that are more complicated. The situations where someone is talking about something Walt Disney actually did, but then adds their own opinion onto the fact, that then becomes widespread. And when you have these types of embellishments, it's easy to replace history with fiction. On TV and in interviews, you would think Walt Disney was a confident, outgoing person, but some say that wasn't the case. In fact, the playwright Robert E. Sherwood once described him as painfully shy, and others close to him said he was also very self-deprecating. But that's not how the public knew him. Uncle Walt was a father figure, not just to his family, but to the US. His kindness radiated through his TV shows, and the stories he told always had a unique sense of optimism that inspired people to believe in dreaming. But this Walt, the exuberant, confident, and eclectic Walt, was a persona. That doesn't mean that he didn't have those qualities when the camera was off, but rather that what people saw was a carefully curated version of the man that wasn't necessarily fake, but just left out many things. I'm not Walt Disney. I do a lot of things Walt Disney would not do. Walt Disney does not smoke. I smoke. Walt Disney does not drink. I drink. It's not a surprise to me that the Walt people saw wasn't necessarily who he was, but what is surprising is that there were other things about Walt that weren't shown in his persona. Things that show prejudice. One of the claims I always see people talk about when painting Walt as an evil person is that he was homophobic. The Disney company has a history of queer coding, so many people point to that as proof of his supposed bias. Well, for starters, a lot of the queer coding people associate with Disney not only has nothing to do with him, but was often done by gay employees, so we can ignore anything that happened after his passing. But there's a good amount of queer coding in early Disney. As I mentioned before, Dan Cupid from Who Killed Cock Robin was referred to as a homophobic slur in a character description by Bill Cottrell. There was also the queer coding of The Reluctant Dragon, with animator Ward Kimball saying that some conservatives at the company resented how gay the dragon sounded. And among other examples, of course, there were queer-coded villains from Walt's time and others that appear to represent queer stereotypes of the time. I think it would be disingenuous to say that Walt Disney was directly deciding how to queer-code characters, or even that he would notice all of the nuances of it, especially since he was mainly an artistic director once the Disney company really went into full swing with their movies. But he did approve everything that was shown, so it's clear that there were certain things that he considered okay. We can also see it in what he said. According to an interview with animator Art Babbitt, while working on Fantasia, he told Walt that he was learning the piano, and after the film was released, Walt asked him about it. In the presence of maybe 50 people at a story meeting, he said, "I understand you're studying the piano." I said, "Yeah, that's true." He said, "Well, what the hell's the matter with you? Are you some kind of f***it?" I don't think this means that deep down he hated gay people. I mean, it sounds like a joke, and Walt didn't seem to hate the piano. But regardless, even if it sounds like a joke, it still shows which vocab Walt thought was okay to say, and in this situation, it meant using a gay slur to make a harmful joke. There are also examples of queerness in early Disney that are more damning than the other ones I mentioned. For example, this Mickey Mouse comic shows Mickey beating up a queer-coded character after he introduces himself, even referring to him as a puff. Since we can see Walt's signature on this comic, it's clear that he himself created it. But not everyone thinks Disney was homophobic or queerphobic. Imagineer Bob Gurr worked with Disney a lot, and though he wasn't out as gay during his time there, some employees knew and others suspected. To this day, he insists that Walt held no prejudice. In the middle of that, working at Disney Studios, everybody was so focused on getting what Walt wanted done, nobody was interested in anyone else's sexual orientation. Walt certainly was never interested. The only time he was concerned was if a guy came back from lunch after 3 martinis and they weren't doing well on a storyboard. Then he would say something. But other than that, he was just not interested. Some people reference this to say that Disney wasn't homophobic. But I think it's perfectly possible that a conservative, cisgender, heterosexual man in the mid-20th century made gay jokes while also employing closeted gay people. Walt was notorious for not wanting sexual innuendo near his work, so it makes sense that sexual orientation wasn't a topic at the workplace. And even if he knew about Bob Gurr being gay, it's possible that he could have been okay with it so long as it stayed private. That wasn't an uncommon belief at the time, and not even today. But I think to say that Disney hated gay people would be missing the point. Without a direct quote from him saying that, all we have is speculation. And this brings up an interesting thing about bigotry. The words we often use to describe bigotry imply some moral obligation. Many people usually associate homophobia with someone who either has a literal fear of gay people, or at least a conscious prejudice, someone who deep down is homophobic. But the word can also refer to every deeply ingrained part of culture that oppresses gay people, regardless of if that's a personality-defining characteristic. This can mean jokes at the expense of gay people, assuming men making feminine gestures are weak, or even just thinking that gay people are okay, but that you wouldn't want your child to be like that. So, homophobia can be who you are, but it's also what you do. And when looking at someone as complicated as Walt Disney, I'd rather focus on the latter. Possibly the most talked about part of Walt Disney is whether or not he was anti-Semitic. But just like a lot of things about Walt, there's things we know, and then there's the rumors. On one hand, you have the image of Walt that paints him as a dedicated anti-Semite who refused to work with Jewish people. On the other hand, you have historians and employees saying that Walt Disney was not anti-Semitic. One of the most well-respected Disney biographers, Neal Gabler, has said that I saw no evidence in my research, other than casual anti-Semitism that virtually every Gentile at the time would have, that Walt Disney was an anti-Semite. This quote is referenced a lot when people debunk Walt's alleged anti-Semitism, but what's always interested me is the part about casual anti-Semitism that virtually every Gentile at the time would have. What does he mean? He read through all of Walt's personal papers, so what is he talking about? We'll come back to that, but for now, let's not focus on what Walt believed or speculate about his views, because unlike his friend Henry Ford, we don't have any pieces of writing showing his blatant anti-Semitism. But we do know what he did, and it's a mixed bag. So let's look at anti-Semitism in the workplace. In a BBC4 documentary, screenwriter Joan Scott described an awkward interaction with someone she described as Walt's right-hand man, asking her that Walt wanted to know what her background was.
I knew, I don't know if it's instinctively just common sense, that he didn't want to know if I was English or French. So I said, I'm really American hash. I'm some English, some Czech, some German, and I'm an eighth Jewish. And you could see this man's face just change expression.
But at the same time, Richard Sherman, one part of the Sherman Brothers, the songwriting duo who worked extensively with Walt, is Jewish and has said that it's absolutely preposterous to call Walt anti-Semitic. Though we should look at the experiences of those who worked directly with Walt and take them seriously, it doesn't help us when they disagree with each other. But at the same time, it's also perfectly possible that Walt worked with Jewish people while also harboring the casual anti-Semitism of the time that Neal Gabler talked about. But what was the anti-Semitism of the time? And how does Walt relate to that? For starters, the original version of The Three Little Pigs featured an anti-Semitic caricature, which was criticized heavily by the American Jewish Congress. In response, Walt's brother Roy disagreed and asserted that the depiction was not offensive and that the studio had Jewish friends and business associates that they would not want to offend. This also seems odd given that Roy Disney once called a business agent he was dealing with an anti-Jewish slur, and employees have shared memories of Walt mocking Jewish people. Though, as I've mentioned, some Jewish employees at the company have said that Walt was not anti-Semitic, but very welcoming to them. In his lifetime, Walt also donated to a variety of Jewish charities, but rumors of anti-Semitism still followed him. And we do know that Walt was a member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization from 1944 that was explicitly anti-communist with allegations of anti-Semitism. Though Maury Riskind, a Jewish member of the organization, was adamant that there was no anti-Semitism in it, allegations say otherwise. Regardless of whether Walt himself was an anti-Semite or not, he had willingly, even enthusiastically, embraced them and cast his fate with them. And having done so, regardless of the awards and charitable contributions, he would never be able to cleanse himself of the taint. The animator Art Babbitt is himself a very complicated figure, but what's important to know is that he was not only one of Walt's longtime animators, but he also became an enemy of Walt, essentially starting the infamous 1941 animators' strike. He was also Jewish and once said that in the immediate years before we entered World War II, there was a small but fiercely loyal, I suppose legal, following of the Nazi Party. There were open meetings anyone could attend, and I wanted to see what was going on myself. On more than one occasion, I observed Walt Disney and Gunther Lessing, Disney's lawyer, there, along with a lot of prominent Nazi-afflicted Hollywood personalities. Disney was going to these meetings all the time. The organization he was talking about was the German-American Bund, a political organization specifically made to promote a positive image of Nazi Germany. Americanism and Nazism were used interchangeably. As you can see in this poster from a 1939 German-American Bund rally, it was a pro-Nazi group, but the poster talks about being pro-American. Walt Disney attending these meetings is contested for a few reasons. Art Babbitt is the only source, and he very much had disdain for Walt, so some people think he could have been lied to or was embellishing the stories. According to Disney historian Jim Korkis, the meetings were also not labeled in Walt's appointment book. In addition to this, Gunther Lessing, the person Walt went to the meetings with, was Jewish. But I don't know. I don't see why Babbitt would lie about such a thing, and maybe the meetings weren't in Walt's appointment book because they were controversial. And Gunther Lessing could have been checking out the meetings like Babbitt was, or he could have been there for other political reasons that ignored the virulent anti-Semitism. But this is all just speculation. And with Walt, it's hard not to speculate when you have stories like that. We only really know what Art Babbitt said. However, we do know that Walt Disney did meet with Leni Riefenstahl, the most famous filmmaker in Nazi Germany, known most for her propaganda films. She visited in late 1938, about a month after the Night of Broken Glass happened, the pogrom in which Nazis murdered many Jewish people in nighttime attacks. She was in the US to attempt to get her propaganda film Olympia released in the country, but getting in with Hollywood was difficult, especially given that a majority of studios had a boycott against her. However, two people didn't care about the boycott: Hal Roach and Walt Disney. Walt invited her to the Disney studios for a tour, and at one point offered to screen Olympia, but then hesitated. People say that Disney had a change of heart and ended up not showing the film, but that's not the whole story. The projectionists who would have shown the film were in a union that was in the boycott, so the film couldn't be shown, and Walt was worried that if he showed it anyway, people would boycott him. Riefenstahl refuted allegations that she helped Nazi war crimes and would take a lot of people to court for not agreeing with her point of view. But regardless of how she personally identified, she worked closely and intimately with Adolf Hitler, and her films were an essential part of the Nazi Party and its propaganda. And after visiting the Disney studios, she had some choice words to say about Walt Disney. That quote is incredibly disturbing, and it really makes you wonder what Walt said to her during the tour. We know that he showed her an early version of Fantasia, likely the Clair de Lune sequence, that was removed from the original film and eventually used in Make Mine music. But the rest of the meeting seems lost to history. So, why was Walt being friendly with Leni Riefenstahl? Could it have to do with the German-American Bund meetings he allegedly attended? Maybe, but that's just speculation. A more likely reason seems to be that Walt Disney was trying to secure a German dub of Snow White in 1938, the year that she visited.
Spieglein, Spieglein an der Wand, wer ist nun schönste hier im Land?
It's no secret that Hitler was a fan of Disney, and when Walt and his brother Roy took a trip to Europe during the production of the film, he was trying to sign a deal with the distribution company to make a German version of the movie. A few years later, Roy Disney would go to Amsterdam to oversee the production of the international dubs, including a German version. The film ended up having a majority Jewish cast, many of them who were prominent performers in Germany, before being exiled to the Netherlands. It's unclear whether Disney knew the performers were Jewish, but it seems like Hitler might have. In the years following the making of the film, much of the cast was murdered by the Nazi regime. It seems that Disney inviting Riefenstahl to the studios was part of his chase to sign a distribution deal for the German dub of Snow White, but his efforts didn't work. It's a bit unclear what happened after Riefenstahl's visit, but in the years leading up to the US joining World War II, the relationship between Germany and the US became more strained. US films were banned in Germany, and Walt Disney reportedly called off the deal, with many people assuming he did because of more information that was being learned about Nazi Germany and the atrocities being committed there. So, the dub was made, and it was even premiered in Switzerland, but not in Germany. After the war, a copy was found in Nazi archives, but it wouldn't be seen again until an Austrian premiere in 1948 and a West German premiere in 1950, and it was later redubbed twice. The 1938 German Snow White dub shows who Disney was willing to associate with, and the line is blurred as to whether those associations reflected his true beliefs or whether or not he was just a businessman who naively thought he could be politically neutral. Once the US entered the war, Disney made anti-Nazi propaganda films for the US government. Though it's known that the studio needed money during this time, the content and Disney's consistent US patriotism suggests that there was a genuine change in which he took a more clear stance. I'm bringing all of this up to show how complicated it is to speak about Walt Disney's character, but maybe that's missing the point. I think looking at who he associated with, what he said, and what he did tells us more than speculating about his beliefs ever could. While working on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt Disney wanted to break new ground. Though his animation studio had already been using music extensively in their shorts, he wanted to try something different. We should set a new pattern, a new way to use music, weave it into the story so that somebody doesn't just burst into song. In a world where songs and musicals weren't always tied to the story, this was unique. And though Walt wasn't the only one developing the US American musical, this type of thing had never been done in animation before. And so Snow White changed animation forever, inventing the format of an animated musical. And the music for the film would set the Disney message into motion. Dreams, princesses, wishing, these all became pillars of the company. And possibly the most endearing theme throughout the Disney company is hope. But these films take a lot of time, effort, and money to make. And though Walt was an incredibly driven person, it wasn't always inspiring. At the time the movie was being made, there were a lot of questions being asked in US culture. Unions were starting to gain notoriety, showing opposition to the nearly impossible amounts of growth and difficult working conditions required by many companies. And though Disney prided himself on treating his employees well, not everyone agreed. Tensions were high at the studio due to unequal pay, overtime that was not properly documented, and some animators felt like they weren't being properly credited for their work. Those were just some of the reasons that led Art Babbitt and other animators to attempt to unionize outside of the company union that was difficult to enact change within. When Walt rejected the union, they went on strike in 1941, at one point even breaking out into a scene where Walt chased Babbitt and allegedly held his fist up as if to punch him. And though Walt was eventually pressured by the National Labor Relations Board to sign a union contract, it took him a while to get there. And along the way, he seemed to get very paranoid. Anyone associated with the strike was a communist, and he worked with the House of Un-American Activities to label them as such, even though that wasn't true. Later he got caught up in the hysteria of McCarthyism, and it seems the paranoia about communists stuck with him. But not everything said about his behavior during this time is true. For example, in the original Dumbo, there's a scene with the clowns that features a song called Hit the Big Boss for a Raise. When talking about the strike, people mention this scene as if it was added by Walt himself despite the strikers, but that's not true. In fact, Art Babbitt himself animated part of the scene and said in an interview with John Canemaker that it came about before there was any talk about striking.
Let's go tell the boss! Hey, let's hit him for a raise!
Yeah, sure, this is White Real Dog!
When Mary Ford applied to work at Disney, she received a letter from Walt that said, "Women do not do any of the creative work in connection with preparing the cartoons for the screen." At the time in 1938, the ink and paint department at Disney was staffed exclusively by women, so he provided her with information on how to apply for that. This seems to track with other quotes about Walt. Ward Kimball famously said that Walt didn't trust women or cats. The refusal to let women work in animation was misogynistic, plain and simple.
Here, hundreds of pretty girls, in a comfortable building all their own, cover the drawings with sheets of transparent celluloid.
Though excluding women was common in animation at the time, there were still other studios hiring them as animators. And it wouldn't be long until Disney ended up hiring their first female animator, Retta Scott, in 1942. So, Walt did some misogynistic things. Who knows why or when his perspective changed, but given how far feminism has come since then, it's clear that that was just part of the beginning of women claiming their agency in the industry. Does this mean that every interaction Walt had with a woman was misogynistic? No, of course not. Nor does this mean that the entirety of Walt Disney's character is irredeemable because he said and did misogynistic things. The reason why this is complicated is because Walt Disney was a multifaceted person, and to understand any heinous things as exceptions to a good person, or as whole indictments of a bad person, would be missing the point that people often do good things and bad things. The role of Walt Disney in culture creates these dichotomies because of how abstracted he is from his work. Many people who grew up with Disney things and this sort of mythical version of Walt might feel genuine inspiration from that. And like I talked about before in my video about Splash Mountain and Song of the South, nostalgia becomes a breeding ground for rewriting history. If you've grown up feeling inspired by Walt's movies, any revealing of a wrongdoing can feel very personal, and you might feel compelled to explain it away. It's not uncommon for me to see Disney fans do just that, talk about something heinous Walt did, only to say that it was a quote-unquote mistake and that it doesn't represent who he was as a person. But that's just speculation. Even labeling it as a mistake implies that he felt some sort of remorse over it, and, well, we don't know that. I get how it is to feel genuine inspiration from such a complicated person. I mean, I run a Disney YouTube channel, and I've made a lot of videos about how Disney things have helped me in discovering my queerness. To know the complicated history of queer coding and Walt's homophobic actions is depressing, but it took a while for me to stop trying to contextualize it as mistakes from a good person. You don't have to think of Walt as a good person in the same way that you don't have to think of him as a bad person. And I'm not saying that we should accept the bad things he did or not criticize them, but when we view them for what they are, we make it easier to remember what he actually did and not promote speculation based on our emotions about who we think he was deep down. The fact of the matter is, people do good things and bad things, and sometimes those things are really good, and sometimes they're really bad. One of the biggest myths about Walt Disney is how he created Mickey Mouse. Well, there are actually a few different myths about how Mickey came to be. All of them begin with the loss of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the character that Walt developed with Ub Iwerks for Universal. Due to control and contract issues, along with having many of his animators abandon him for a different studio, Disney cut ties with Universal, and while finishing his contract, he began developing a character in secret who he would own all the rights to. From there, the story gets fuzzy. One version mentioned that Walt was inspired by a mouse he saw at the Laugh-O-Gram office. Another said Mickey came from a mouse he noticed while sitting on a park bench. He told a few different versions of the creation of Mickey, but perhaps the most well-known one is that on his way home from New York after losing Oswald, he sketched the mouse. After showing his wife Lillian the new character named Mortimer, she said she didn't like the name and suggested Mickey instead. In some versions of this story, Ub Iwerks refined the character after Walt created him. As you might guess, the real story is more complicated. Even just with naming the mouse. In the Neal Gabler biography on Walt, he shows a few different versions. Lillian claimed at one point to have renamed him from Mortimer. Oh, and by the way, she said that Mortimer was too sissy. But Disney archivist David Smith has said that she didn't seem too sure that she named the character after all. And though Ub Iwerks once said she did, he later retracted his statement. He said that he came up with the name Mickey, and in a wholly unrelated story, the name was apparently chosen just because it was shorter. In reality, the creation of Mickey seems to have been a bunch of different influences mashed together. After Iwerks tried a few different types of animal characters, a mouse seemed most fitting. Mice had appeared in Disney's work before, and some say Iwerks had been inspired after seeing sketches for posters by Hugh Carman that had Walt with cartoon animals, some of them mice. But the most likely influence seems to have come in the form of mice in Clifton Meek cartoons. Who drew Mickey first is debated. Some accounts say Iwerks drew him first, and Walt refined him. Others say the opposite, and that Walt drew Mickey too skinny and that Iwerks redesigned the character. Regardless, Mickey was a collaborative effort, but you wouldn't really know that from the stories that Walt told. So it's more complicated and less romantic than the story of him on the train. But this does show an interesting side of Disney. Walt liked having complete creative control, and that didn't just stop with the art. It was also about how it was presented. And in the case of Mickey, taking most of the credit seemed to be a part of that. Uncle Walt was very much a collaborator, but he always seemed to get the most credit. Having the Disney brand be singular was part of the whole deal. And the image of Uncle Walt telling families inspiring stories made it so that when many people think of Disney, they think of him, and less of the fact that by the time Snow White was being made, he was more of an artistic director than an animator. Walt getting most of the credit is just a natural consequence of having a company named after himself and also being the face of it. But animators feeling neglected and not properly credited for their work was one of the reasons why the 1941 animators' strike happened. Walt's creative control also had an effect on those around him. While working on Bambi, he reportedly had a few clashes with Frank Churchill, the composer writing music for the film. In the Neal Gabler biography on Walt, he wrote that Churchill had written a great score for the musical circle of Hollywood, Walt griped, but one that was monotonous and did not provide the excitement the movie needed. Before Bambi was released, Frank Churchill took his own life, reportedly while at the piano. And when talking about this, many fans talk about how it was because of his arguments with Walt about the music for Bambi. And with versions of the purely evil Walt Disney floating around, that's kind of easy to believe. But we don't know that. The truth is, at the time, Frank Churchill was dealing with depression, alcoholism, and the loss of two close friends who had passed away in succession. This doesn't mean that the stress and pressure he had from Walt couldn't have contributed to his condition, but that's a bit different than saying he took his life because of an argument he had with Walt Disney. Another thing about this story is that Frank Churchill reportedly asked Disney to dedicate the song Love Is a Song to his wife, but Disney didn't end up doing it. But what's left out of that story is that the song had already been submitted for publication when Churchill had asked. Maybe Walt could have had the song withdrawn and resent with the dedication. I don't know, but that's just speculation. When telling this story, it's just Walt got in a fight with Frank, Frank took his life, and then Walt didn't honor his last wish. As I've shown in this video so far, there's plenty of things to criticize about Walt and his actions, but when we place him in a box of only evil or good, then it's easier to fill in the blanks, not with fact, but emotion. When people talk about Walt Disney, they usually say that he was a product of his time. But what does that mean? I think everyone probably uses that phrase differently. The most common version I hear is people excusing certain bad things by contextualizing them in the time period in which they happened. The contextualizing isn't wrong. When talking about queerphobia in the 1920s, for example, it's important to talk about how mainstream society was more, or at least differently queerphobic than it is today. But excusing things or acting like there was no moral opposition to them because of the mainstream response, well, that's not really telling history. As I mentioned in my video on Splash Mountain and Song of the South, while Walt was making the film, there was plenty of opposition from the NAACP. And, of course, we can't forget the other examples of racist stereotypes that appear in his work. So when saying that Walt was a product of his time, I think what people mean to say is that it was common back then for people like Walt, people who were men, white, cisgender, and heterosexual, to say and do certain things. And not only was it common to say and do certain things, but those actions weren't viewed as bad by mainstream society. But we have to be careful to not absolve any sort of moral obligation. I don't think saying Walt was a product of his time is a bad way to put it. It's certainly helpful for contextualizing his actions within the society of the time. But often that's used almost as if to put up a wall between today and history, instead of just viewing them as being related. Instead of acknowledging the opposition he faced at the time for the films he made, it's ignored. Talking about Walt Disney requires knowing the context of his time, but we have to know the whole context, not just his perspective. There's really no secret about our approach. We keep moving forward, opening up new doors and doing new things, because we're curious, and curiosity keeps leading us down new paths. Despite everything that I've said, Walt Disney still inspires me. I admire the drive he had to create new formats. In his lifetime, he revolutionized multiple industries, and it didn't seem like he was ready to stop. Watching Disney movies growing up helped me find myself, and going to the theme parks allowed me to create fond memories with loved ones that I'll never forget. I love Walt's creativity and artistic style, and the ways in which he would assemble incredibly talented groups of artists to create some truly memorable movies. When people talk about Walt Disney today, they're not talking about the man himself. They're talking about the mythical version that he wanted them to talk about. Walt is still very much celebrated and at the center of the company, but it's also common nowadays to be in the Disney fandom and be very critical of Walt. He may have started the company, but today it represents much more than he intended it to. Maybe Rivers Cuomo had a point when he sang about feeling just like Walt Disney. Though he wasn't cryogenically frozen like in the song, while Walt was an incredibly driven and creative person, at the same time he seemed stuck in his ways, in his perspective. Given how focused he was on his specific creative vision, it doesn't surprise me that some of the movies and comics and theme park rides he made only reflected his perspective. So it's okay to be inspired by a version of a man who never really existed, just so long as you know about the man who actually did.